So thank you very much for coming. This is lecture 5 of 7, and tonight we're talking about the soul. And if you had looked at the original schedule, we were supposed to do soul number 4 and beauty number 5, and I switched them around for a couple of reasons. But the main one is just because yesterday was All Souls Day. The day before was All Saints Day, and the day before that, of course, was Halloween, which used to be known as All Hallows Eve, the eve of All Saints Day. Of course, we don't use that term anymore, but it's worth remembering that Halloween used to be just a minor event, a trick-or-treating event that became popular really after World War II. But it was a very minor sort of thing that kind of piggybacked on these two other very large holidays in the life of the Christian Church, All Saints Day and All Souls Day. It's remarkable that now Halloween is the second largest holiday celebrated in the United States by the amount of money we spend. We spent approximately $13 billion, about $4 billion just on candy. And most people don't know anything about All Souls Day. And I think one of the reasons is we just don't use the word soul very much. We use it sometimes in religious contexts. I find I'm a lifelong churchgoer, and even there we don't really talk about souls very much. And we don't talk about ourselves being souls. And this is a fascinating thing because the word soul has such a fascinating history. Now, I want to explain one of the reasons why we don't use the word soul anymore. And there's a couple of reasons. One is that we have several different traditions that have different views of the soul. But also because we've so thoroughly adopted the scientific view of studying everything in the universe, including ourselves, that makes the soul irrelevant. And I want to talk about why that is. So the first tradition that we have, and this is common to like most of the major religions, have some kind of word translated as soul that's more or less identical with the idea of the self. So there's some kind of spiritual conception of the self that is really central to our identity or our essence. The religious tradition that we're most familiar about within the United States is Christianity. And in Christianity, the idea of the soul is kind of complex, because the word that's translated soul, the Greek word psyche, is sometimes translated soul, sometimes it's translated life. Sometimes it's, in other translations, it's just self or essence or something like that. The early Christians did not seem to have any kind of consistent or coherent idea of what the soul is. And most of them had a very firm belief in the resurrection of the body. And that's why when you look at something like the Apostles' Creed, there's nothing about believing in the soul, but there is a line, I believe in the resurrection of the body. So this was considered to be really essential for the idea of the afterlife. And even passages that are attributed to Jesus, like what should it profit a person who gains the whole world but loses their soul? In half of the translations that are popular now, it's not loses their soul, it's loses their life. And the idea is, like, what does it profit you to gain everything you want but lose yourself, lose your capacity for love, you lose your self-identity? It seems to mean something like that, and that would be very consistent with this Greek idea of psyche. The larger Greek tradition that the Christians are operating within the context of has some very interesting thoughts about this idea of psyche. In fact, they have several they have several words that could be translated as soul, and that in different kinds of translations of their works, we get the translation of soul. The main one is psyche, which also just usually means something like our essence, our personality, that is who one really is. But there's also pneuma, and from which we get something like pneumonia, or a pneumatic, like a pneumatic tire, the idea of wind or breath or air. And this idea of wind or breath then comes to represent life. So there's two words that can be translated as life, that is psyche and pneuma. But then we also have nous, which is the mind or the intellect. And sometimes some of the writers that are talking about nous, or our mind, sometimes that's translated as soul. So we've got really three words that get translated in that way. Of the Greek writers who talk like most deliberately about soul, is Plato, and Plato has this kind of what is for us a really strange theory. He calls it the tripartite theory of the soul. Sometimes it's suggested what he means by that is like a person is constituted by mind, body, and spirit. It's more accurately translated as the soul consists of intellect, our thinking capacity, reason, spirit, or our emotional life, and then desire, like our appetite, our capacity for desire, which is sometimes he uses the word eros for that. So I find that really fascinating. That if we want to understand who we are, Plato says, you have to understand that we have really three core functions that make up our personality, our capacity for thinking, for feeling, and for desiring. The other tradition that is really in some ways still alive in our society comes from Descartes. Now, Descartes is the 17th century philosopher, so he's operating in the 1600s. He's mostly a mathematician, and he's trying to present a philosophical theory of the world that makes room for mathematics to study everything that's in the world. And he does this pretty successfully, so much so that we really trace the modern scientific method largely back to Descartes. But he does this by separating body and soul. That is, he separates what he calls the mind or soul. He kind of conflates. They're the same thing, and they're entirely different kinds of the mind or the soul is entirely different from matter, material stuff. And human beings are the only beings that combine both into one entity. Like everything else is one or the other, either soul or body, and most of the stuff that we experience in the world is body, that's material. And what's characteristic of material stuff is, first of all, it's tangible. We can touch it, we can grab it, we can change it, but most importantly, we can measure it. And because you measure it, you can have a method for studying it. And so, and what do you use to measure things? You use mathematics. And so he creates a system where like really everything we encounter is measurable, is studied by then this newly developing idea of a scientific method. And then the soul becomes what we know about ourselves through introspection. And so he has this famous line, I think, therefore I am. We only know like that we are minds or souls because we can think. And as long as we think, we know that we are, but that's the only way. You can't observe minds, you can't observe souls. This he claims, like he's very concerned at the time about the persecution of Galileo by the Catholic Church, and he doesn't want to be presenting a theory that gets him in trouble with the church. So what he does is he really builds up in the preface to his work this idea that he's presenting a theory that proves the immortality of the soul and the existence of God. But what he's really interested in doing is laying the foundation for science that can study everything in the world through mathematics. And what this does is it makes religion irrelevant to the study of everything in the world. If we look at then this fourth kind of tradition that we have for studying understanding the self, who we are, what we call the soul, it becomes then a scientific approach that claims that the only kind of valid knowledge we have of anything is what can be observed, what can be measured, what can be stated in some kind of hypothesis and tested, and then verified by neutral parties, neutral observers. Well, that makes any kind of traditional understanding of the soul unverifiable and really unknowable. And so that's pretty much the status that we have. This is why, like at universities now, I don't know if there are any classes outside of religious studies that talk about the soul at all, right? Because how would you know it? How would you test it? How would you even study it? And this is kind of where we are in our society. We have a scientific community and a population which is largely educated through our universities in a method that makes the soul irrelevant and pretty much a matter of superstition, along with a society where, according to last year's religious life survey conducted by the Pew Research Center, 86% of Americans said they believe that human beings have souls. And so the question is like, well, what do they mean by that? Because it's not something we study. It's not something we talk about very much. So it seems most people have some kind of idea of what a soul is, and yet I have no idea what most people mean when they use the word, because we don't talk about it. Well, this is where Freud comes in, and where I think Freud is really useful. And it might seem odd to bring up Freud in connection with the soul, because in some ways, Freud is part of this like new kind of scientific understanding, and the approach that he brings to psychology is a scientific perspective that seems to make any kind of religious understanding of the soul irrelevant. That's partly true and partly false. The reason it's partly false is Freud, in his writings throughout his lifetime, talks about the soul all the time. He uses the German word Seele, which is translated as soul. And yet, in all of the English translations, the word Seele is not translated as soul. That word is translated as mind or intellect, or sometimes self. And this is a curious thing. Why would that be? I think it's because the translators are really interested in presenting Freud as a scientific thinker, and especially in the English language, the word soul has such a religious connotation, they don't want to suggest that. Whereas the German word Seele doesn't really have a religious connotation to it, but it does have this connotation of something that is not measurable, not quantifiable, not studied by science. And Freud talked quite often about his real distrust of two categories of professionals: priests and medical doctors. And he's usually represented as a medical doctor, and he didn't think that that's what he was doing at all. In fact, he was really opposed when he proposed a theory of psychoanalysis. The American Association of Psychoanalysis wanted to license practitioners, and he was opposed to it at first. And then later on, he gave in and he said, well, that would be okay. But probably because he thought that America really didn't matter. Like, so psychoanalysis would always be based in Europe, where Europe had a really rich culture. What he didn't envision is the Nazis kind of destroying all of the existing culture, and most of the people that were practicing psychoanalysis at the time were either killed in the concentration camps or emigrated to Great Britain or the United States. And so you have this kind of a lack of understanding of what Freud was talking about. So I want to take a few minutes just to suggest to you that it's worth revisiting Freud and what he said about the soul, because he thought some really fascinating things. One is that we know ourselves largely through introspection, and that's incompatible with scientific knowledge of ourselves. Scientists want to study everything in the world through observation and by third parties or neutral parties. And he didn't think that's really possible with the self. He thought, we do not regard ourselves as objects, we regard ourselves as subjects. And so then you need an approach to studying the self, which takes introspection seriously. Now, when we do introspection seriously, what do we find? Well, we find that we are mysteries to ourselves. We are full of contradictions, and we are continually doing things that we ourselves don't understand. And how do we know that? He wrote 2 books early on in his career. One was The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, and the other was The Interpretation of Dreams. And he said, if you look at either our dreams and you take this seriously by, say, keeping a dream journal, which you can only do is like when you wake up, you have to immediately write down your dreams, because otherwise you forget it. But once you do that, you realize you dream all the time, and you dream some really weird stuff. And when you start paying attention to a lot of this really weird stuff, it starts to make sense because it's connected with things that you are going through in your life at different times. The other thing that he wrote about in The Psychopathology of Everyday Life is that we are always doing things seemingly by accident, but that express a real purpose, like slips of the tongue. We'll call somebody by somebody else's name, and we'll pass it off as, oh, I just forgot your name. I just used the wrong name. But inside we know, like, it's because that person reminds us of the other person or something. Like, there's some intention here. We'll have these purposeful forgettings. Like, there'll be times where, like, we have this dentist appointment that we really didn't want to go to, but we're looking all over the house for our car keys, and we just can't find them. And then finally, like, it's too late. We realize, I can't go, and you pick up your purse, and the keys are right underneath where you set down the purse, and you realize that you set your purse down on top of the keys. Was that intentional? And you say it wasn't, but you did not want to go to that dentist appointment, and now you didn't have to go. Like, and the psychopathology of everyday life is just filled with example after example of this. People saying things or doing things that betray some kind of unconscious intention. One of the really funny examples is it talks about a really arrogant lecturer. I don't know if he was talking about himself or not, but he was, and who got up in front of this audience and said, and I can count the number of people who understand my theory on the hands of one finger. And so these little slips, they can reveal something about what we actually mean, even though we're saying, well, that's not what I meant. But actually, it's exactly what he meant. He was the only one who understands what he's saying. I find that psychopathology of everyday life really powerful, not in demonstrating that there can be, say, a science of the unconscious, and that's not what Freud is trying to do. He's trying to give us a way of kind of understanding that when we talk about ourselves, who we are is much greater than just our conscious thoughts. Like our soul is not what we think consciously. It's very rich and full of all kinds of things. And here is the problem. It can be full of all kinds of things that contain conflicts that we've never resolved in our life. And if we don't find a way of resolving these conflicts, we end up sabotaging ourselves. We end up sabotaging ourselves. We end up sabotaging our relationships, because everything that is in the unconscious, any kind of conflict that resides there that we don't figure out how to resolve, gets expressed somehow in our lives. And then he says, and when there are groups of people that have unresolved conflict of the same sort, that gets expressed in the culture, right? Well, I find this really fascinating for understanding American culture. Like, why is it that we have all kinds of kind of unresolved conflicts? We're claim we're an overwhelmingly Christian nation that follows a teacher who gave us the great commandment to love one's neighbor with all our heart and soul and mind, love God with all heart, soul, and mind, love our neighbor as ourselves. But our most popular forms of entertainment, movies and TV shows that feature revenge and violence. You look for the past 20 years at the top 10 movies of every decade, and 6 or 7 of them every year will be very violent films. How can we both follow a teacher who told us to love one another and seek entertainment in violence and revenge? This is contradictory. It's an unresolved conflict. I think it's an unresolved conflict that goes deep within ourselves, but that is shared with a lot of our culture. And then we see it expressed in all kinds of violence that comes up that we don't know quite what to do about it. So I think Freud ends up being onto something that's quite important. I think a lot of the reasons he's regarded as mostly bypassed today, certainly by professional psychology. Most students of psychology today never read anything by Freud. There's a few paragraphs in the book that kind of explain him as maybe the father of psychoanalysis, and then say a little like about his obsessions with sex or something like that, and then move on. What they don't do is talk about the ways in which Freud was. He was thinking like we as human beings, we're the same human beings that human beings have always been, and human beings have always struggled with issues of conflict, inner conflict and turmoil, betrayal, and also always been driven by love. And so this is why psychoanalysis is named after the Greek myth of Psyche. Psyche, who falls in love with Cupid, the god of love, Cupid or Eros, the god of love, and then betrays him because he tells her that, like, no matter what, you cannot look at my face. And one night when he's sleeping, she takes the mask off. She promises she won't, but then she removes the mask. And so he banishes her. He goes to her mother, his mother, her mother-in-law, and she gives her a series of tasks to do. One of them is to go down into the underworld and retrieve something from the underworld. And it's only when she does all these tasks and comes back from the underworld that she is able to be reconciled with Eros, with her love. And this basically is what psychoanalysis is, according to Freud. This is why he names it after psyche, is because we always betray the people we love. We don't necessarily do, we don't think we want to, we don't do it intentionally, we do things. This is a part of like having a really complex soul that has a dark side to it. And we do things that hurt other people, hurt the people that we care most about. And then we have to be reconciled to them. But if we don't travel down into our own dark side and discover, why are we acting this way? Why are we doing this? We're just going to keep doing it again. And so we could never be fully reconciled. And so what Freud is suggesting is that we take seriously the idea that life is never going to be perfect. We always are going to struggle with some darkness inside of ourselves. But there are ways we can learn to both acknowledge it and then come to terms with it, so we can be reconciled and then have workable, loving relationships with other people, within our family and within our society. And this is what a healthy society does. So I've given you a few questions. I hope this explains a little bit of like why we have this, I would say, kind of like, in some ways, some kind of contradictory ideas about the soul itself. Like why most people believe in the soul, but Halloween is much more popular than All Souls Day. And the fact that like we don't talk about it, and yet we have some kind of belief in it. I think like what we really need is some kind of language for how we talk about the soul that doesn't put it just in spiritual terms. And so I've given you some questions here. One is, of the four traditions of the soul, which do you find most compelling? Like, do you find any of these traditions kind of compelling and that you relate to? Or is there some other version, some other idea of the soul that you find more interesting or more compelling? Also, think about, are there any slips of the tongues or forgettings or misreadings, any of these things that Freud talks about that he calls the psychopathology of everyday life that you can recall that puzzled you or interested you at the time that you made it? And then, are you aware, are there conflicts in our society? I mentioned one, like our profession of love, but our fascination with violence at the same time. But are there other things that just seem contradictory in our society that are hard to explain, how we're driven to both things at once and can never reconcile them? So take about 15 minutes or so to talk about those at your table, or any other questions or observations you have, and then we'll come back for a general conversation.